women's groups from Afghanistan and Afghan diaspora groups in general to understand what they're looking for. I think what they're looking for is for us to continue to be tough on the Taliban and condemning what they're doing, sanctioning them, etc., and also to look for ways to support civil society, opposition groups, and to remain hopeful about what the future of Afghanistan could look like. That we can see a post-Taliban future sooner rather than later.
And when the honourable member comes back, there'll be a whole minute and 35 seconds left in questions and comments. Statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, on July 11th, this Sunday, a rally will be held on Parliament Hill by 2,000 Iranian Canadians to again protest the failure of the Canadian government to get justice from Iran for the January 8th, 2020 shooting down of flight PS 752. That horrific act murdered 176 people, 55 of which were Canadian citizens and 30 permanent residents. One of those victims was a friend. Sunday's rally will also demand that the Canadian government abandon its ongoing reluctance to list the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, and for the government to finally take action against Iranian operatives who are harassing and intimidating the Iranian community in Canada. From Parliament Hill to Toronto City Hall and Richmond Hill, I have stood in solidarity with Canada's Iranian community. Will this government? To date, the protesters have received useless platitudes and empty promises. Hopefully, the government's indifference will soon end. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton, Canso.
Mr. Speaker, in the early 1970s, the former Town of Dominion Police Service established the Police Boys and Girls Club, an organization to support and engage youth in the local community. 50 years later, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that this club and its initiatives are going strong. With that, it's my sincere pleasure to congratulate the Police Boys and Girls Club on its 50th anniversary. Today, the club provides activities for nearly 125 youth in the Dominion area. And that's an incredible feat, Mr. Speaker, which certainly maintains impact on our communities. Mr. Speaker, our youth are our future, and organizations such as the Police Boys and Girls Club reassure me and should reassure everyone in this House that the future is very, very bright. Thank you to all the community volunteers, past and present, who devoted their time over the course of the 50 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Barrie, Springwater, Oromadante.
Mr. Speaker, Barrie, Springwater, Oromadante is home to many great firsts. My community is home to the earliest published recipe of the iconic Canadian treat, the butter tart. The Oro African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is one of, if not the oldest African log churches still standing in North America, and the historic Fort Willow Conservation Area, which was actively used as a supply depot during the War of 1812. Just recently, our community, specifically the small town of Midhurst, became home to another historic first. Mitchell Hooper, a Midhurst resident who aptly goes by the nickname The Moose, was crowned the champion at the 2023 World's Strongest Man Finals in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. At this year's competition, Mitchell Hooper became the first man to win 4 events and 6-event final at the World's Strongest Man, and the first Canadian to ever win this prestigious title. The Moose is a big, strong man who also has a big spirit and lives by his own mantra, lift heavy, be kind. Congratulations, Mitchell, for your many hours of hard work and dedication.
The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. People from the Philippines who have visited Canada in the last 10 years or actually have a current USA valid visa, Mr. Speaker, will now be able to travel to Canada via air visa-free. Mr. Speaker, this is wonderful news. Today, all those eligible can now go online and apply for the electronic travel authorization. And in most situations, they will be approved within hours, Mr. Speaker. That is big news for thousands of people who will be directly benefiting by that throughout the country, Mr. Speaker. Nowhere more than the city of Winnipeg. The estimated population of Canada's Filipino community today is 1 million people. Manitoba makes up about 10% of Canada's Filipino heritage community. The north end of Winnipeg is where you will find the heart of Canada's Filipino community, which means that an announcement earlier this week made on June 6th will benefit the residents of Winnipeg North more than any other community in the country, Mr. Speaker. June is the month in which we celebrate Filipino heritage. What a great month it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, once again I am standing up for Canadian athletes who are demanding an independent national public inquiry into abuse in sports in Canada. To date, over 1,000 athletes in 14 sports and 27 organizations have called on the government for a national inquiry. The Liberal response has fueled outrage by survivors and sports advocates who feel ignored in their request to drop the piecemeal improvements and implement a national strategy. Band-Aids will not heal these athletes, and abuse in sports is not new. Athletes at the heart of the sports system deserve better protection and meaningful changes. Sports needs to change. Consider how poorly the Toronto Blue Jays have dealt with their own locker room hate. The Liberals and the Blue Jays need to get off their bass and do the right thing.
Hear, 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 hear. The honourable member for Canada Carleton.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has a world-class medical isotope ecosystem. From production to processing to delivery, we house almost the complete isotope supply chain. One of Canada's largest medical isotope clusters is in my riding of Canada Carleton. Companies like Nordion, Best Theatronics, and BWXT Medical are leading the market in developing, manufacturing, and supplying isotopes. These companies contribute billions to Canada's economy, and they employ hundreds of people in my riding. Their expertise and innovation is literally saving lives. Their isotopes are being used to diagnose and provide effective new treatments for illnesses like cancer, transforming the medical sciences field. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to working with industry to leverage this already strong foundation to truly put Canada on the map as the world leader in medical isotopes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, it is a busy June in my area with some remarkable milestones I'd like to recognize. I'm happy to announce the start of the 172nd Annual Millbrook Fair, an opportunity to celebrate agriculture and enjoy countless family-friendly activities happening this weekend. Best wishes to Fritz Mattern, Rick Dowdle, Bill Lockwood, Sean Thurston, and Dave McGee on their retirement from Kawartha Lakes Fire Rescue. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. 2 Haliburton County legends are celebrating 90th birthdays this month. Ed Picard spent his entire working career with the RCMP, serving his community, including past presidents of the Royal Canadian Legion in Haliburton and zone president. In fact, the main hall in Branch 129 is being named after his late wife, Billy. And to Betty Hayward, a longtime volunteer on the Harcourt Hall Board of Directors, a lifetime member of the Ladies Auxiliary, Royal Canadian Legion, and Wilberforce, and the founder of Busy Bees Sewing Club. I hope all members will join with me in celebrating these individuals and many others across the country who give so much to make their communities better.
The honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize a very special group of young advocates in my riding of Hamilton East, Stony Creek. The Grade 1 class of Winona Elementary School, led by Mrs. Merritt and Ms. Tylee, petitioned our government for an expansion on our ban of single-use plastics. They collected hundreds of fruit and vegetable price lookup stickers and mailed them to my office in support of Maya's plastic pollution campaign. And the campaign builds upon our actions last year when our government initiated a ban on 6 different types of single-use plastics. Over the next decade, this world-leading ban on harmful single-use plastics will result in the estimated elimination of over 1.3 million tons of hard-to-recycle plastic waste and more than 22,000 tons of plastic pollution. While our actions will go a long way to prevent more damage to the environment, wildlife, and human health, we know that more needs to be done. And initiatives like Maya's plastic pollution campaign serve as a reminder for all levels of government that expanding our efforts to ban single-use plastics is a priority. Thanks again to the students and teachers of Winona Elementary School for their advocacy on this very important issue.
The honourable member for London North Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to honour the life of Dimitris James, or Jimmy Agathos, who unfortunately passed away recently at the age of 92 after a battle with Parkinson's disease. For those who knew him, they knew him as a proud Greek, a proud Londoner, and a proud Canadian. He immigrated to London from Greece in 1951. A few years after, he began working as a busboy at Hotel London, and in 1963, he opened the Huron House restaurant. For anyone who grew up in London, they know the Huron House as a community meeting place, as a staple business in London, Ontario. He supported, in addition, many causes. His entrepreneurship and the success he enjoyed as an entrepreneur, Mr. Speaker, was shared with the wider community. For example, he sponsored every year no less than 35 minor sports teams in our city. For that, in October of 2022, he was inducted into the London Sports Hall of Fame, in addition to many other recognition points that he received, awards of distinction along the way for numerous volunteer activities. To his sister Olga, to his wife Catherine, his many children and many grandchildren, thank you very much. We share our deepest sympathies with you. You must be very proud. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, this government has been running massive deficits ever since it took office. All this debt has predictably triggered an inflation crisis, which has led to massive mortgage rate hikes. Half of all homeowners say that their mortgage was already barely affordable, and now they are one renewal away from a shocking new payment that will add $1,400 a month to a typical family with a mortgage. Rate hikes are also crushing the dreams of new buyers and threatening to collapse transactions that are currently in progress. Young Canadians face housing prices that have doubled, rents that have doubled, and now the highest interest rates in 25 years. I beg this government to stop making things worse. Stop the massive deficits that cause inflation and that are driving up mortgage rates to the point that homeowners can't pay for the homes that they own and young people give up hope of ever owning one.
Here. L'honorable député de Pierrefonds-Dollard.
The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard.
Weekend, I visited the Art Cave exhibition presented by the mixed media class for the neurodiverse at the Dollard Centre for the Arts. Ce cours est donné.
This course is led by Kiana at the Civic Centre every Sunday for 8 weeks. This is an important meeting place for neurodiverse young adults.
People with autism, ADHD, Turcot syndrome, and OCD. It was a pleasure to see the amazing art by Laura, Katia, Alicia, and other students. Art is a valuable expression of people's lived experience, thoughts, and feelings. The artistic environment built by Kiana allows neurodiverse young adults to experiment, explore, and promote their self-expression. The Art Cave empowers unique voices through artistic expression. It fosters empathy and understanding within our society. Thank you, Kiana, and to all the students for your amazing work.
The honourable member for Dauphin, Swan River, Neepawa.
Mr. Speaker, June marks Filipino Heritage Month. From coast to coast to coast, we celebrate Filipinos who have enriched the social, cultural, and economic fabric of Canada. Filipino Canadians have helped bring hope to so many of our communities with their ongoing achievements and vibrant culture. As Vice Chair of the Canada-Philippines Interparliamentary Friendship Group, I recently joined Filipinos in Greater Toronto area, where I met with the Filipino Chamber of Commerce and celebrated the incredible music, dance, art, and traditions of the Philippines at the Toronto Filipino Centre. Later this month, I'll be in Neepawa, Manitoba to celebrate Filipino Independence Day, home to a vibrant and growing Filipino community. A day when the people of the Philippines celebrate the day they rose up and demanded their freedom. On behalf of all Conservatives, happy Filipino Heritage Month. Mabuhay!
The honourable member for Sturgeon River, Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government has added more to our national debt than all previous governments combined. The only thing worse than a tax and spend Liberal is a borrow and spend Liberal. Liberal deficit borrowing is driving up interest rates, making Canadians' loans and mortgages more expensive. And Liberal overspending is driving up the cost of goods and services, making everything, including our homes and our food, more expensive. Now, Albert Einstein once said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world, and that those who don't understand it will face the consequences. As interest rates rise, Canadian homeowners are facing the consequences, and Canadian taxpayers are facing the consequences of an exponential increase in government interest debt. Eventually, this debt needs to be repaid. We can't burden future generations with this overwhelming responsibility. It's time to save Canadians' finances by ending these Liberal deficits and balancing the budget.
The honourable member for Sudbury. Mr. Speaker, across the country, people are forced to leave their communities because of forest fires. or forced to spend days under a blanket of smoke. In Northern Ontario, there are currently 50 active fires. I'd like to thank all of the firefighters who are so bravely committed to fighting these fires. We are working to protect the public and make our communities safe. We are investing in training more community firefighters, and we are reaching out to Indigenous peoples so that they can apply their traditional knowledge to fighting the threat of forest fires. We are welcoming hundreds of firefighters from other countries to support our efforts in the days and weeks to come. We will continue to work together to keep Canadians safe and to build strong, resilient communities.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak about the urgent need to address the toxic drug supply crisis that is costing lives in Winnipeg Centre. Yesterday, I joined local frontline organizations, advocates, and elected officials in calling on the federal government to work with Manitoba to increase the number of naloxone kits in Winnipeg. The situation is so dire that some organizations have been forced to source supplies from other provinces. Their message is clear: more kits are desperately needed. We also need to start treating the overdose crisis as a public health issue, not a criminal issue. I've been disgusted by the rhetoric we've been hearing from the leader of the official opposition, who has been whipping up fear and spreading misinformation about this issue. Yes, we need more funding for addiction treatment, but we also need to keep people alive. Someone who fatally overdoses from poison drugs can never recover. That is why I'm urging this government to expand safe supply programs, decriminalize personal possession, and fulfill its promise to implement a dedicated mental health transfer. Lives are at stake. We must act now.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, it is in times of adversity that we see the best of humanity. Right now, in the riding of Lac-Saint-Jean, which I've had the honour of representing since 2019, there is a beautiful ongoing mobilization which aims to soothe the fears of the people of the James Bay region who are afraid of losing their homes. This huge wave of support shows once again just how much we all stick together in Lac-Saint-Jean. People are lined up to volunteer. Offers of places to stay are all over social media. Businesses are opening earlier to welcome people who want to help out of pure humanism. It's really, really beautiful to see, Mr. Speaker. While the teams, who are immensely courageous, are busy putting out the fires, the situation is getting under control, but still very worrisome. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to finish by saying this. To those who've had to leave their homes in the last few days, to all those who are affected directly or indirectly by the fires, to the SUPFIT teams, the Bloc Québécois is here for you.
The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Speaker, let's play a game of Jeopardy! I choose budgets balance themselves for $1.22 trillion.
Hey.
This Liberal deficit will saddle our kids and grandkids with insurmountable debt for generations to come. Answer, what is $61 billion? This increase in prices is at its highest in 40 years, raising the cost of groceries, gas, and everything Canadians buy. Answer, what is Liberal inflation? This burden on families is making owning a home unaffordable for millions of Canadians, and it doesn't come down soon. It will result in the loss of their homes. Answer, what are Liberal interest rates? Finally, for $1.22 trillion, this Canadian political leader will end the destruction of the middle class and those who currently see no hope in joining it. Answer, who is? The member for Carleton. It's your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it home!
The honourable member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, the days of having to rely on images of crumbling glaciers and Amazonian deforestation to express urgency with respect to the climate emergency that we find ourselves in are history. The climate emergency is at our doorstep, in our neighborhoods, and over these past few weeks, in our lungs. Whether it's the wildfires, floods, droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, or other extreme weather events, climate change is impacting our daily lives more than ever before. The wildfire smoke that enveloped Ontario is beginning to move south, causing our neighbors in the United States to have to stay indoors. There has never been a more urgent call to action on our collective obligations to combat the climate crisis. To quote Dr. David Suzuki from one of my favorite books, A Sacred Balance, there is no no environment out there that is separate from us. We literally are our surroundings. Indigenous people are absolutely correct. We are born of the earth, constructed from the four sacred elements of the earth: air, fire, and water, and earth. And yet all week, despite acknowledging Clean Air Day and World Oceans Day, the Conservatives continue to debate the most basic of all tools to decarbonize and combat the climate crisis. Mr. Speaker, climate change is a public health and emergency, and it impacts every single Canadian.
Good job. Good job. Oral questions. Question orale. The honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, it's simple. Massive Liberal deficits cause inflation to rise, which forces interest rate hikes and mortgage defaults. The solution is clear. Stop the deficits, which slows inflation, which prevents the interest rate hikes, and saves people's homes. This week, the Bank of Canada increased interest rates to 19 times what they were last year. Will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending and save Canadians' homes?
That's right. Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Speaker, in this last year, the Canadian economy has grown by 3.1%. Canadians have created close to 900,000 jobs. 2.7 million Canadians have been lifted out of poverty. 9 million Canadians are getting access to dental care. Child care costs are coming down by 50%. And guess what? Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7. We've cut taxes for small businesses. We've cut taxes for the middle class. There is definitely more work to do, but we have the tools to make life more affordable for Canadians.
Honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is cold comfort to Canadians who are skipping meals, families who are cancelling their kids' sports activities, and families who have no hope of having a summer holiday, even for a couple days of camping. And young Canadians, entire generation, have lost all hope of ever owning their own homes. But the Liberal solution to spend more and drive up prices. Budget bill after budget bill after budget bill, the Liberal Prime Minister and Finance Minister keep taking away more and more opportunities from hard-working Canadians. Will the Liberals pull back on their budget bill and replace it with one that does not throw more fuel on the inflationary fire?
That's right. Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I think it is really important to talk about families because we are the party that introduced the CCB. We've lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. And when parents are trying to make ends meet, one of the most important things that our government is doing is lowering the cost of childcare. I've had multiple parents complain to me over my parliamentary life about the fact that the cost of childcare was equivalent to a mortgage payment, but they don't say that anymore, and it's going to get better because we're going to continue to reduce it until it's $10 a day.
The honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I hear from parents are parents who are working 2 and 3 jobs, working every hour of overtime they can just to put food on the table. And Mr. Speaker, rent has doubled under these Liberals. It's harder and harder for families to make ends meet at the end of each month. Conservatives have offered to stay here as long as it takes to fix the Liberal budget bill. Will the Liberals stay here, fix their bill, eliminate wasteful spending so that Canadians can finally get some relief from their inflationary crisis, or will they just go on vacation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Speaker, unlike what the Conservatives are saying, Canada is working and Canadians are working. Canadians have created close to 900,000 jobs since the pandemic. But you know what? There was a time for the Conservatives to positively contribute their solutions to the Budget Implementation Act. That started in April. Instead of doing that, they decided to filibuster the entire thing. They sent food banks home. They sent chambers of commerce home. They didn't want to hear from Canadians on how we can make it better. So their suggestion that they're going to come back in the summer when their homework was due 2 months ago is quite hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Louisa Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, let's just talk about the facts for all Canadians. After 8 years of Liberal governance, with compulsive deficits and no control in spending, here's the reality. Uncontrolled deficits generate inflation. Inflation raises interest rates. High interest rates mean that people may risk losing their house. That is the reality every single day here in Canada, but especially in the months and years to come. Why is the government not doing what it did last November? That is, going back to a plan for a balanced budget. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, after inflation peaked at 8.1%, it has gone back down to 4.4%, and the Bank of Canada expects it to go down to under 3% by the end of this autumn. Mr. Speaker, Canada has had the best economic growth last year. Next year, the OECD is expecting us to have the strongest economic growth once again. Canadians should trust and can trust in the resilience of our economy. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to my colleague, the reality is that if he goes to talk to people who are about to lose their house, they will laugh in his face because they can no longer pay for their homes anymore. Is he going to buy their homes for them? If he wants to quote studies, the International Monetary Fund says that Canada is the riskiest country in the OECD when it comes to mortgage loans. The governor of the Bank of Canada himself says that house payments could rise by 40% due to inflation. That's the reality that people experience every single day. Why does the government refuse to have a plan to balance the budget? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as I have just said, Canada is expected to have the strongest economic growth in the OECD, in the G7 this year and next year. Mr. Speaker, one thing that my honourable colleague has not mentioned is the fact that today, there are 900,000 more Canadians that have jobs than those that have lost them during the pandemic. 128% more jobs than we had before the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can trust in their future. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, let us talk about Chinese interference, or rather let's talk about those who are victims of it and whose government refuses to talk about it. Defenders of democracy from the diaspora from Hong Kong, Taiwan and the Solomon Islands. Minorities such as Uyghurs and Tibetans. Their representatives have all come out with a Bloc Québécois to demand a public and independent inquiry into Chinese interference. Not because they're choosing sides in a partisan squabble, because they want to protect their communities and they feel abandoned by their government, by this government. When will it stop ignoring their call for an independent and public inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, what Canadians expect is that all parliamentarians in this place take the issues of foreign interference extremely seriously, that it's not a partisan issue. And part of that, Mr. Speaker, is actually doing the work that comes with Mr. Johnston's report. And I note that the leader of the Bloc has decided not to actually look at the information that is provided to him that is the basis of Mr. Johnston's report. So, Mr. Speaker, if opposition want to criticize the work of Mr. Johnston, they should first look at the documents included.
The Deputy de Saint-Jean.
Mr. Speaker, the picture speaks for itself. None of the pro-democracy groups, representatives of the diaspora and minorities who are victims of the Chinese regime support the government's approach. None whatsoever. And the government would know this if its rapporteur had taken the time to talk to them before publishing his report. They're all calling for a public inquiry led by an independent commissioner with subpoena powers. They want us to finally get to the heart of the matter and tackle Beijing's meddling tactics. Finally. When will the government finally listen to them? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Protecting Canadian democracy is a responsibility that we take very seriously. When the opposition wants to play political games, we on this side are taking serious measures. We want to continue with the implementation of a transparency register on foreign interference. We want to strengthen the control and oversight mechanism when it comes to protecting our democratic institutions. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, a 9th interest rate hike by the Bank of Canada is hitting Quebecers hard. Imagine having worked all your life to fulfill your dream of buying a house, Mr. Speaker. Then, a few years later, you're forced to sell it because your monthly payment has risen from $2,300 to $3,800, a 64% increase in just 1 year. That is the harsh reality for families in Quebec and just about everywhere else in the country. What are the Liberals going to do to help these families who are losing or are about to lose their homes? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. We all agree that Canadians have been hit by an increase in rent and mortgages. The federal government implemented a national housing strategy. Not only that, we also invested money in municipalities because everyone has to be around the table for these decisions. In the 2023 budget, we will take measures and publish directives to help people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
CEOs cash in on their quarterly profits, Canadians lost 17,000 jobs in 1 month alone. To Liberals and Conservatives, economic recovery just looks like somebody else's unemployment. But for everyday people, it looks like economic punishment. So at a time when there is deep despair, why does this Liberal government refuse to fix unemployment insurance while so many Canadians continue to lose their jobs?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's economy remains strong. We have experienced the strongest economic growth in the G7 over the last year. Our unemployment rate remains low at 5.2%. We have recovered 128% of the jobs lost since the start of the pandemic. However, we are also working hard to make sure that we are looking after all workers, including those that have lost their jobs. We are making record investment in skills training, record investment in affordable housing. We're partnering with labor and industry on generational investment in the VW plant in St. Thomas and the Stellantis plant in Windsor, and we are modernizing the EI system to make sure it is there for all workers when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
In a growing conflict of interest, the Prime Minister's rapporteur was paying the same firm for advice as one of the people he was supposed to be investigating. That person, of course, is the former Liberal member for Don Valley North, who left the Liberal caucus amid a foreign interference scandal. And Johnston didn't even interview him. Canadians don't trust this process, and they can't believe Johnston's report. Will the Prime Minister finally call a public inquiry like this House has called on him to do 3 times?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, unfortunately, what we see is another Conservative who is taking a page out of the Trump playbook, where it's just personal attacks when they don't like the outcome. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives made the conclusion prior to Mr. Johnston's report they were never going to accept it. So to pretend now that it's the process they're upset about, when, Mr. Speaker, all it is partisan games, we on this side of the House take the importance of our democratic institutions seriously, and that's why we appointed someone with Mr. Johnston's credibility to this position.
The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
If they took democratic institutions seriously, they'd respect the will of the democratically elected people of this House. Voting 3 times for there to be a public inquiry instead, they wanted a Liberal solution to a Liberal problem, and that's why they appointed a member of the Trudeau Foundation, who then hired some Liberals to help him out, and when he thought he was in a conflict of interest, asked another member of the Trudeau Foundation to say that he wasn't. Now we learn, of course, that he and the person he was supposed to be investigating were both getting advice from the same firm. It's levels of conflict of interest with these Liberals. Canadians have had enough. A majority of them want a public inquiry. Will the Prime Minister finally call one today?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, once again, Canadians can see on full display that the Conservatives are not serious about foreign interference. What they'd rather do is just take personal attacks. Another proof point of this, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that we had David Johnston at Proc for over 3 hours, and the Conservatives, in their precious questioning time, didn't ask a single foreign interference question for over 15 minutes worth of their time. Instead, they went for personal attacks because, Mr. Speaker, to them, foreign interference is a partisan game, but to Canadians, it's serious business.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister's loyal rapporteur, it is conflict after conflict. He hired the crisis management firm Navigator, the same firm hired by the member for Don Valley North, who happened to be the subject of a rapporteur's investigation and for whom the rapporteur conveniently exonerated without even interviewing. This conflict goes to the heart of a rapporteur's questionable conclusions. His report has no credibility. He needs to go. When will the Prime Minister fire him and finally call an independent public inquiry?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the Conservatives question Mr. Johnston's report, yet their leader, they're cheering.
Just hold on. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, they're cheering the fact that they live under a veil of ignorance, and they're proud to do so. Mr. Johnston's report, they question, even though their own leader has said he refuses to read the information in which it was based on. So, Mr. Speaker, if Canadians want to see somebody who is serious in this House on foreign interference, they should not look at the Conservatives, because all we see is question after question, personal attacks.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, enough is enough. The conflicts are everywhere. The rapporteur is a family friend of the Prime Minister. He is a member of the Beijing-financed and compromised Trudeau Foundation. He hired a team of Liberals to draft and defend the conclusions of his report, and now this. How many conflicts with this rapporteur is the Prime Minister willing to ignore? When will he fire him and finally call an independent public inquiry?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, what I find highly suspicious is the fact that the members opposite sit and take nothing but personal attacks and offer no solutions, no suggestions on how to actually strengthen our democratic institutions. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are nothing more than conspiracy theories, personal attacks, just like the Trump administration. But on this side of the House, we take these issues seriously because that's what Canadians expect.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, this week we've seen a lot in the scandal of Beijing's interference in our democracy. First, the Loyal Liberal rapporteur, who sees absolutely no conflict of interest in his role, and the fact that he is a great friend of the Trudeau family, that he was a member of the Trudeau Foundation, that he sought advice from another Trudeau Foundation friend, etc., is not an issue. Then we saw that the special rapporteur omitted important facts and witnesses from his report. Yesterday, we learned that the Loyal rapporteur and a Liberal MP targeted by his investigation had hired the same crisis management firm. How can Liberal MPs blindly follow the Prime Minister in yet another conflict of interest? When will they finally send the rapporteur packing? Well, let's speak about the special rapporteur. I have a quote here from the leader of the Conservatives, who he himself said, "We have before us a very credible individual," and I think that history has very little to do with the fact that he has had a very distinguished career. End of quote. Conservatives had decided to play political games. They could simply just follow and receive the information from our intelligence bodies. The honourable member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Since then, he's been trapped by the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Sacha Trudeau, Sheila Bloch, Valérie Blais, Don Guy, Pierre-Éliott Trudeau, David Johnston, Frank Iacobucci, Maurice Rosenberg, Member of Parliament for Don Valley North, Navigator. All these people and organisations have links with the Prime Minister. Now, the problem is that these are all main players in the play put on by the Prime Minister to avoid triggering an independent public inquiry into Beijing's interference. No one believes in Mr. Johnson's independence anymore. When will the Prime Minister finally fire his friend Johnson and launch a truly independent inquiry? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister for Economic Development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague once again wants to play political games with protecting Canadian democracy. We take this very seriously on this side. The Conservatives are focusing on political games. On this side, we are taking measures. This rapporteur is eminently qualified, and no one in my riding, no one has come up to me to say that this person was not credible. So we're working with a trustworthy person. He is studying the matter, and we'll work well with him, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, after 9 months of lockout at the port of Quebec City, just imagine, employees have just received their first offer from management, and they rejected it by 98%. How could this happen? Simple. At the federal level, the employer has no need to negotiate. It hires strike breakers and replaces workers with crabs, just like in 1920. It's the federal government that's responsible for getting this dispute bogged down with its labour laws worthy of the last century. When will it finally move into the 21st century and ban scabs? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Labour.
Mr. Speaker, through you to the member, this government has done more for Canadian workers than any government in the past. We are on track. We are continuing to support workers and the bargaining process, both the employers and the workers, and we are on track to ban replacement workers by the end of this year. It's part of the budget, and we're on track to do it. Merci.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, well, let's do it now. Not you, Mr. Speaker, but the government. And that is the reason for which the Bloc Québécois has once again tabled another bill to ban scabs. Quebec has banned scabs since the 1970s. What's good for all workers in Quebec should also be good for workers under federal jurisdiction. This government claims to defend the middle class. Well, if that's the case, when will it take up our bill and ban scabs, which allow workers' rights to be trampled underfoot?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour.
Speaker, as I mentioned, we are on, we've wrapped up consultations. We're taking the feedback that we have received from unions, employers, and Indigenous groups to inform our legislation, which will be tabled by the end of this year. This is the latest evolution in policy to protect the collective bargaining process. We need to strike a balance between doing it quickly and getting it right. So I encourage the opposite member to support our budget so that we can get this job done.
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, the Bank of Canada hiked interest rates. This is a direct result of the government's inflation-inducing fiscal policy driven by frivolous tax and spend policies that bankrupt Canadians. As a result, reams of struggling Canadians will default on their mortgages, putting the dreams of homeownership even further out of reach. We do have a solution. We will stop the deficits, rein in inflation, stem interest rates, and end the defaults. Mr. Speaker, are they willing to put partisanship aside, work with the opposition, and end this inflationary deficit spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Monsieur le Président, écoutez, j'allais répondre sur le logement, mais je dois avouer que...
I must admit on the matter that the last comment from my colleague has surprised me. If she wants to collaborate, I would invite her to stop filibustering on the budget. In a budget that seeks to give strict directives to protect Canadians when it comes to getting mortgages in exceptional circumstances. It's in Budget 2023 and they voted against, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we have been extremely clear. We are willing to put party politics aside, sit down with the government and hash out a budget that will actually help Canadians instead of punishing them. Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government is far too eager to ram through this legislation in this House instead of putting in the necessary work to deliver a fiscally responsible budget. Mr. Speaker, will this government accept our proposal to work together, sit down with us on this side of the House, and work in the best interests of Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we know that all the students that go to summer school are the ones that don't do their homework throughout the rest of the year, and that's exactly what the Conservatives did. They spent 2 months filibustering the budget. We were talking about how we could positively contribute to solutions for affordability for Canadians, to create jobs for Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and for more than 6 weeks, the Conservatives decided to talk to themselves and send away Canadians that were coming to the table with solutions that were going to work. So for them to come up this morning and say that they want to revamp a budget over the summer, I invite them to draft it. It would be nice to have a single solution in this House from the other side.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Essex.
Speaker, this Liberal Prime Minister, along with the costly NDP coalition, have made the dream of home ownership and starting a family far out of reach for working young adults in my riding. They have done everything they were asked to do and left with only fear and tears. Yeah. Speaker, will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending and let young adults begin their lives and start a family?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, youth unemployment has gone down under our budget. We've provided more jobs through the Canada Summer Jobs Program, so we're making sure that there are jobs available, whether that's on small craft harbors in Atlantic Canada, whether that's in the aerospace industry in Quebec, whether that's at car manufacturing in Ontario, on farms in the prairies, or in biotech companies in BC. We're going to make sure that there's lots of opportunities for young individuals to have high-paying, sustainable jobs in the future. That's why we're investing in this country, because we believe in the future, unlike the Conservative.
Here, here. The honourable member for Essex.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Liberal NDP coalition doesn't care about the future generations, what do they say to the homeowner that can't pay their mortgage because this Liberal government overspent and caused inflation, which caused mortgage rate hikes? This Prime Minister is stripping the hopes, dreams, and house keys from the hands of Canadians. Shameful. When will he realize the pain and suffering he is causing?
Here, here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister.
I think context is important. Inflation in Canada is in fact coming down. It reached a peak of 8.1%. It's now at 4.4%. It's going to go below 3% as it's projected before the end of this year. And despite the fact that it's coming down, it's already lower than what it is in the United States, what it is in the United Kingdom, what it is in Europe, and what it is in the OECD. That means that we can afford to make investments in making life more affordable. No Canadians are convinced that their lives are going to be more affordable by getting rid of dental care, getting rid of child care, eliminating the CBC, stopping to fight climate change. They have no good ideas on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
None. The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, close to 1 million people living with a disability live in poverty, and the Liberals left them to suffer. The Canada Disability Benefit must be the solution to finally enable them to make ends meet. Otherwise, this government continues to be part of the problem. People living with a disability deserve to live in dignity. Will the Liberals ensure that this new benefit will lift people living with a disability out of poverty?
Here, here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable colleague for the excellent question. I thank her for her collaboration and her advocacy on this critically important question. In Canada, no person with a disability should live in poverty, period. That's why we are creating the Canada Disability Benefit, an income supplement with the potential to seriously reduce poverty and improve financial security for hundreds of thousands of working-age persons with disabilities. In February, this House unanimously adopted Bill C-22. Bill C-22 is now on the calendar for debate in this House for June 14th. We are looking forward to getting this legislation past the finish line as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Nunavut.
I stand in solidarity with the unionized workers and their families of the Iqaluit Housing Authority. They have been on strike for close to 3 months. The Labour Minister remains silent as the Iqaluit Housing Authority brings in scabs and undermines workers' rights. New Democrats have introduced anti-scab legislation to stop this. Will the minister support the NDP's bill to protect unionized workers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour.
Speaker, the best deals are made at the bargaining table, and federal mediators are in touch with the parties. Our federal mediators are very good at what they do, and we have faith in their ability to help parties reach an agreement. We're on track to ban the use of replacement workers by the end of this year, but we need to strike a balance between doing things quickly and getting things done right, as I mentioned before. Thank you very much for the question.
The honourable member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic has strained our healthcare system, disrupted our economy, and changed the way we interact every day. We know that better health care for Canadians means supporting our healthcare workers and ensuring patients receive timely access to health services they deserve. Yesterday, the Minister of Health announced direct support to Medical Council of Canada, the National Registry of Physicians, the Foundation for Advancing Family Medicine, and Canadian Alliance of Medical Laboratory Professional Regulators. Mr. Speaker, can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health and to the Minister of Sport please tell this House how yesterday's announcement is addressing current and emerging labour demands in healthcare?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from Richmond Hill for his hard work and his excellent advocacy in his riding and on Health Committee for foreign credentials qualifications. Mr. Speaker, yesterday our government announced $78.5 million for 3 projects that support foreign credentials qualifications for internationally trained medical graduates to grow and support our healthcare workforce. These projects will help improve the process for recognizing foreign credentials for internationally educated health professionals and improve labor mobility for physicians, making it easier for them to work where they are most needed throughout our country. Our government's priority remains to work together to support our healthcare workers so that patients across Canada get the care they need when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, this government continues to add fuel to the inflationary fire, despite the finance minister's words that deficits must be reduced and that this is a line that cannot be crossed. Well, what happens? Inflation goes up, so interest rates goes up, so Canadians default on their mortgages and Canadians lose their homes. What's the solution? The solution is to stop the inflationary spending, stop the interest rates so that Canadians can have lower inflation rates and lower interest rates. Is the government ready to do this, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that the Conservatives don't believe that we can fight inflation and fight climate change at the same time. Yet, emissions and inflation are both coming down in Canada. Canadians have created over 900,000 new jobs. We have the lowest deficit and the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. And in addition, the IMF and the OECD now both project that Canada will have the strongest economy in 2023 and in 2024. This gives us the tools that we need to address affordability. And of course, we have a national housing strategy, which is the first time the federal government has invested in housing in over 30 years.
Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Have the greatest level of household debt in Canada that we have ever had. And as well, the IMF states that out of the G7, it is Canadians who are most likely to default on their mortgages. Wow. Even the finance minister recognizes that Canadians are struggling. She said that Canadians are facing hardships as a result of high interest rates. So then why doesn't this government commit to eliminating inflationary deficits, eliminating inflationary spending, so that Canadians can have lower inflation and lower interest rates, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. As she knows, the National Housing Strategy is not just helping people to pay their rent. It's also to help them access the dream of owning a home. My colleagues on the other side voted against the budget, which had measures to help Canadians directly if they're struggling with mortgage payments under exceptional circumstances. I invite her to read that part of the budget and vote in favour of it.
Falls.
Speaker, the IMF warns Canada is at the greatest risk of home mortgage defaults in the world. This Liberal government's out-of-control spending and massive deficits have caused inflation to skyrocket. Canadians cannot absorb these higher rates, placing their dreams of home ownership at risk. Families are struggling, and they are struggling because of this Liberal government. Will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Speaker, despite what the Conservatives say, everyone knows that inflation is a global phenomenon, but inflation in Canada is lower than our peer economies, and we have the best fiscal framework in the G7. Our budget not only retains this fiscal advantage, allows inflation to continue to decrease, makes life more affordable for Canadians, invests significantly in healthcare and in dental care, while creating high-paying, sustainable jobs to go above and beyond the close to 900,000 jobs that Canadians have already created.
The Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Speaker, Canadians simply can't afford the higher cost of living brought about by these Liberal government's policies. They are being forced to work more shifts or find a second job simply to get by. Canadians deserve our help, and Budget 2023 only makes the cost of living crisis worse. Conservatives are ready to work through the summer to fix their mistakes. Will this Liberal government cancel their vacation plans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, my summer plans are going back and talking to my constituents, finding out possible solutions to make Canada better, and I hope that Conservatives will do the same. I wish that the Conservatives will do what they say, go over the summer, find solutions, and bring it to this House. The only solutions that they brought to this House so far is cancel the CBC, stop the fight against climate change, raid the pension benefits of seniors. Those are not viable solutions, Mr. Speaker. So if they can spend the summer coming up with some positive solutions, I'll be happy to work with them.
L'honorable député de Terrebonne.
Monsieur le Président, quand les confinements...
Mr. Speaker, when lockdowns came at the start of the pandemic, the government set up the Emergency Business Account for small businesses. Maximum loans of $60,000, with $20,000 being forgivable if people repaid it within a certain time frame. And it was the right thing to do. 900,000 small business owners needed it. But the December 31 deadline is coming fast, and 40% are worried they won't be able to pay back the loan in full, which would mean losing eligibility for the loan forgiveness part of their loan and threatening their survival. Can the government offer them a little flexibility? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. I appreciate the question from the Bloc Québécois because it highlights the importance of small and medium businesses here in Canada. We've always been there to help and support small and medium business. We reduced tax from 11 to 9%. The opposition voted against it. We've always been there during the pandemic with the loans that were mentioned by the member for the other side. What we've just done with the budget is reduce transaction fees for credit cards for small and medium businesses, and the opposition voted against. The honourable member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't even does not even seem to be able to answer its own questions. Now, December 31st seemed like a reasonable time at the start of the pandemic, but there were variables that extended the crisis: supply problems, costs, labor shortages, deserted downtowns. With 6 months to go, almost 250,000 businesses are at risk of closing down. Will the government allow them, if needed, to enter into repayment agreements without losing the forgivable part of their loan? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. What we need to focus on is that the loans granted to small and medium businesses were a maximum of $60,000, and a third was forgivable if they were able to repay 2/3 by the expected timeline. We're always listening to small and medium businesses when they have concerns, and that's why in the budget we've reduced transaction fees linked to credit cards that affect small and medium businesses here in Canada. Thank you.
For Bam Fairdrie.
Well, not long ago, the Liberal Minister of Finance said, by exercising fiscal restraint and by not pouring fuel on the fire of inflation today, we will ensure we can responsibly invest in Canadians and in a Canadian economy for years to come. Yet, here we are, $60 billion in new spending and interest rates at their highest level in 22 years. They call that restraint? They're practicing about the same amount of restraint as a kid in a candy store. So when will they stop gouging Canadians and end their inflationary spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we are putting forward a plan that is fiscally responsible. That's why inflation is coming down. If the member is not aware, it peaked at 8.1%. It's now at 4.4%. It is projected to go lower than 3%. If that member thinks that he's going to convince Canadians that he's going to make life more affordable by suggesting that we delete all the programs that make life more affordable, like dental care, like child care, like the CCB, like investing in retirement security for seniors, I don't think he's going to fool anybody other than perhaps the other members sitting on the other side of this House.
A member for Bam Fairdrie.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about the people that are hardest hit by the...
Okay, hold on. I know someone doesn't know how to use their headset, maybe, so I just want to make sure people have their headsets on mute. I know it's the first day with some stuff like this. So, okay, ready? The honourable member for Bam Fairdrie.
Let's talk about the people hardest hit by the Liberals' inflationary spending, just for a minute here. They claim to be a champion of equality. They claim that, and they weave that word into every announcement they make. But for them, it's nothing more than a buzzword. In the words of one of the Prime Minister's own former advisors, government spending will impact disproportionately lower-income Canadians and young families, potentially creating divisions and threatening new sorts of inequality. So when will this government drop the platitudes and stop gouging the Canadians struggling the most?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives have no credibility when it comes to supporting families. When they were in power, they sent out checks to millionaires with their universal child benefit. Our Canada Child Benefit has supported tens of thousands of families in my riding alone, Mr. Speaker. If the Conservatives really want to support families, then they should support dental care, which has provided dental care for 1,100 members of constituents in the riding of Carleton, over 1,000 kids in my riding as well, Mr. Speaker. How about some solutions from the other side rather than just constant slogans?
L'honorable député de Montmagny-Lillette, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup.
Mr. Speaker, for 8 years, this Prime Minister has spent lavishly, leading to devastating effects for Canadians. Accumulated deficits are leading to inflationary pressures. Everyone knows this. Inflation led to higher interest rates. The Bank of Canada just raised its rates, and now mortgage payments are higher. When will this Prime Minister finally understand that he has to stop inflationary spending that is pushing people out of their homes and into the streets? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. I invite my honourable colleague to look at the budget because he can see very clearly that the deficit is going down over the next several years. All of that in spite of the contrary winds blowing around the world. Within G7 countries, our budget, our government, has the lowest deficit. We have the lowest debt. And our GDP to debt ratio is the lowest. It's thanks to our leadership that we were able to achieve these targets. The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, last week, there was a very important meeting between federal, provincial, and territorial governments on protecting wildlife and biodiversity. They talked about how to work together to hit very significant targets in terms of biodiversity, which they agreed to at COP15. One of the most important targets is the goal of protecting 30% of our land mass. Can the Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment inform this House on Canada's progress? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. I thank my colleague for her question. COP15 in Montreal was an incredible victory for Canada and the planet. We're going to draw up an action plan. I'm pleased with the commitment of provinces and territories to contribute to our goal of conserving 30% of Canada's land by 2030, an objective based on slowing the decline of wildlife species. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, on September 16, 2021, Cody McConnell's life was forever changed because his fiancée, Michael Bush, and 16-month-old son, Noah McConnell, were murdered by a registered sex offender who was deemed highly likely to reoffend. Noah's law will protect vulnerable women and children who are most likely to be victims of sex offenders. Mr. Speaker, will the Liberals do the right thing? Pick up the bill and make Noah's Law a reality today.
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I salute the empathy and the place from which that good place from which the question came. Mr. Speaker, our sympathies go out to Cody McConnell and his family and friends for his loss. I tabled, Mr. Speaker, in the Senate Bill S-12, whose intention is precisely to preserve and strengthen the Sexual Offenders Registry. Mr. Speaker, I've undertaken publicly, and I will do it again now, to look at the proposed Noah's Law to see if it is in conformity with what we're trying to do, and to work with members across the floor to see what we can do.
Honourable Member for Regina Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, 8 years of this
Liberal government have given Canadians higher deficits, higher inflation, and higher interest rates, which of course leads to higher mortgage payments. According to a recent study by the International Monetary Fund, Canadians are now the most at risk to default on their mortgages. And this problem will only get worse as more and more Canadians renew their mortgages at higher interest rates. Mr. Speaker, when will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as I've had the opportunity to say many times in this House, our plan is fiscally responsible. Inflation is coming down. It's at 4.4%. We expect it to be less than 3% before the end of this year. At the same time, we're investing in making life more affordable, and we can afford to do that because we have the lowest deficit, and because we have the lowest net debt to GDP ratio, and because we have the fastest growing economic growth at 3.1% in the G7. We need to take advantage of our good fiscal framework and make sure that we make life more affordable for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Immigration designed overly narrow criteria for admitting the families of Afghan language and cultural advisors whose lives are now in danger. They can't get to Canada, and the Minister refuses to schedule meetings with Afghans who want to fix the rules and save these lives. Why can the Minister find the time in his schedule to announce visa-free travel for people from other countries, but not to take a meeting with a brave Afghan who served Canada and whose family may be killed because of that service?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for his questions, and certainly I want to reiterate to this House that the resettlements and resettling of Afghans remains our very top priority. These Afghans have worked side by side with Canadian Armed Force, and our mission in Afghanistan is to promote the peace and the democracy in this region. But let me be very clear, Mr. Speaker, we will not turn our backs on these brave Afghans who have worked with us, and we will do everything we can to get Afghans to safety. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Member for Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, we know that a significant gap remains for Indigenous peoples living in urban, rural and northern areas when it comes to housing. There's an urgent need to act now. Could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing elaborate on how our government is upholding the right to housing as per UNDRIP's Articles 21 and 23, with an emphasis on the for Indigenous, by Indigenous approach, and how this recently announced partnership with the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated is designed to rapidly address the urgent needs and long-term housing challenges of Indigenous peoples across Canada.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague for his questions and all his hard work. Too many Indigenous people in urban, rural, and northern communities do not have the housing they need. That's why our government committed to a co-developing for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. Yesterday, we announced an immediate funding of $287 million with the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing, and it's just the beginning. Through the budget 2023, we're investing an additional $4 billion. As we advance towards reconciliation, our focus remains on providing safe, affordable home for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Albertans have made it very clear they do not want coal mining in the Rocky Mountains. Coal mining in the eastern slopes threatens our land and our water. It's not good for our planet. It's not good for Albertans. Yet the minister is fine with an Australian coal mining company carving out more than 500 hectares of Grand Mountain. Based on my private member's bill, this government promised that all coal mining would trigger a federal environmental impact assessment. Albertans want it, First Nations want it, so where is the impact assessment on the Grand Cache mine?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we have a commitment to end the export of thermal coal, and we are working across all sectors of our economy to make sure that we're reducing emissions. We put in place a robust impact assessment system that is there to make sure that there are regional assessments and impact assessments that take into account environmental concerns, and that we have a very objective system that is there. I make sure that the member opposite looks at the improvements that we have made towards those policies.
The honourable member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, in May 2022, the IRCC committee tabled a report that noted overt and subtle racism at its offices abroad, especially at posts where visa decisions were delegated to locally engaged staff, such as in South Africa. It's come to my attention that an unofficial filter system has been incorporated in that country. White local staff are overwhelmingly refusing visa applications from predominantly black South Africans. Indeed, white visa applications are being placed in one pile and non-white in another. Mr. Speaker, this is unconscionable. Can the minister confirm or deny if Canada is running an apartheid-era visa selection process in South Africa?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear that we have zero tolerance for racism or discrimination of any kind. That's why we've already hard at work to address the racism and create real, lasting change. We created the Anti-Racism Task Force. We continue to provide training to address unconscious bias to all of our employees. Also, IRCC has released our new Anti-Racism Strategy 2.0, Mr. Speaker, but we know that there is more to do, and we will keep working hard to keep fight of all discrimination and build on our finding. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
That's all the time we have for question period today. Thank you for your indulgence. I think we have a point of order from the Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request that the ordinary hour of daily adjournment of the June 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th sittings be at midnight, pursuant to order made Tuesday, November 15th, 2022. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
First of all, thank you on behalf of chair occupants so we can get that schedule done. Pursuant to order made on Tuesday, November 15, 2022, the minister's request to extend the said sittings is deemed adopted. Any other points of order? Okay, we're good. Daily routine of business. Depot de point of order. Okay, the honourable member for Calgary-Mindapore.
Calgary, the best place on earth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance said Conservatives shut down witness testimony of finance. In fact, it was the Liberal Committee Chair that skipped over 10 hours of committee testimony. They didn't want to hear from Canadians that are saying that they're...
I believe that's descending into debate. It was a unanimous consent, so all those opposed to the motion, please say nay. Yay! I hear a number of nays. Always a good try. Always a good try. All right. May I proceed? Any other points?